Welcome to the Unbecoming Hub podcast. Reflections about being human without treating yourself as something to fix. I'm your host, Lacey Kelly. Today, I want to talk about the mental health model and some thoughts I have on it. I want to start off this episode by saying a couple things. One is that I have been helped immensely by therapy, particularly by one therapist that I've had in my life that I saw for a few years, and she really helped me stabilize my relationships. And I'm very grateful for that work. And I've seen therapy help a lot of people I work with my clients, as well as people in my personal life. So, nothing about this episode is a criticism of therapy, but more so the mental health model that it operates within and the constraints that it may have on therapy that we may not realize, and maybe some of the unintended consequences that are starting to show up from therapy being delivered in the current mental health model. I also want to say that the people I work with, in my clinical practice, I specialize in relationships. And that can be a relationship of any form. It can be dating, marriage, romantic relationships, friendships, family relationships, the relationship you have to yourself, just generally relationships. And I chose that specialty because, one, I find it very interesting. Two, it's been my pain point. And three, it tends to reveal a lot of deeper issues that are just so human. So my lens in framing all of this and seeing all of this comes from my work sitting with people with very human issues. And that there are diagnoses and experiences in the mental health field where our current mental health model works really well. And there's just a huge percentage of it where it doesn't, because I think with less community, less spiritual or religious belonging, less connection to a higher purpose or something, where people used to go when they felt woe about an experience, a person, a situation, a relationship. People are kind of starting to turn to therapy for that. And it may not be the best platform for those kinds of issues. So that's kind of more what I'm going to be exploring today. So all that being said, I think it's always helpful to look at the history of things when you're trying to understand it. So I just want to do a brief overview of modern mental health therapy's roots, where it comes from. Because before psychology was even a field or a thought or a thing, human suffering obviously existed. And humans were seen differently than they are now. The soul of a person was assumed. There was an understanding of an animating life that existed within a human body. And the mind and the body weren't separated. The soul wasn't separated from the mind and the body. But the soul was kind of the ground in which the mind and the body lived. So the animating life was there, and the mind and the body lived within it. And so when human suffering was happening, it was seen as a rupture between the human experience and something bigger than the human experience. So that could be community or the natural world or whatever spiritual orientation was around at the time. Human suffering was seen as human. It wasn't seen as a problem. It was just part of it. But the intervention around it came from community or ritual, storytelling, initiation, rites of passage. There was a completely different approach to human suffering. Way back. Way back. And I think that, you know, there just weren't as many ideas and thoughts out there. So human suffering was just part of the deal. And in some cultures, it wasn't even treated as anything special. There was no doing anything with it. It just existed. It wasn't seen as like a problem. It was just part of the experience. There wasn't the resistance. It just was a fact. And, it kind of started to shift in early philosophy days. But even in early philosophy days, you know, human suffering, human emotion was still seen as human and not problems to solve, but reason was used to interact with those experiences differently. So it became like, how do I be with this part of being human? But we certainly weren't trying to reason our way out of things yet. We were using reason as an assistant to the soul and the human experience. Then we get into the Enlightenment period where that kind of changed and reason dominated. This was the era of Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and kind of marked the shift from a soul led human experience to a cognitive or mind led human experience. So the mind became the primary center of being human. And I think that was it made sense at the time. There was a lot of religious abuse and superstition, and it's kind of a way, I think, to gain power or fight power that was being misused at the time. So it makes sense. It was there. But it really kind of started this shift from the soul experience to the mind experience. And that followed into the scientific revolution, where if it couldn't be measured or verified, it wasn't seen as legitimate. So obviously, subjective experience doesn't quite fall in those bounds. And at the time, psychology was emerging as a discipline. So it inherited this bias of needing to be verified to be true, accurate, whatever. And the early folks in the field of psychology, like Freud and Jung, they tried to hold on to the soul in it all. They very much looked at meaning and the subconscious as a inherently protective, not necessarily broken or a problem. They looked at symbolism and dreams and this more abstract interaction of being human. But they were very fringe, so they were, on the outside of things, kind of mocked at the time, like seen as silly. And it wasn't until behaviorism really came about, B.F. Skinner, and the early folks of classical conditioning that psychology started to be seen as a legitimate field because you could control and measure and manipulate behavior. So this was really like the big change where soul was out, behavior was in, and behavior was seen as, oh, we can do something about human problems if we can change the behavior. So all the focus went there, and unfortunately had pretty awful consequences with the interventions that, as with most things, were all well-intentioned in the beginning, like asylums and lobotomies, all well-intentioned in the beginning. Obviously turned quite tragic for a lot of people. Even early days of electroconvulsion therapy, was seen as a breakthrough, but it's, the folks that received it would have something different to say. So when behavior became something, we can change this, we can modify this, therefore we can control people. That was a dark time for psychology. And then we kind of emerged out of that, realizing these practices were inhumane, and we turned away from them, which was good. very glad we did that. But the unfortunate part was that the mental health model remained. It's just the interventions became humane and consensual. We took consent and do take consent very seriously in the field, largely because of that dark past. So, but the approach of seeing individuals as a collection of symptoms that manifest into certain behaviors, and that if you can change the behaviors, you can alleviate the symptoms. That model is still very much based, that's what we still use today in a lot of different areas in the field. And like I said earlier, there are issues that people experience that model works really well. Like obsessive compulsive disorder, for example. A really good friend of mine works in that, specializes in that with ERP and sees amazing results with her clients. Whereas I've worked with individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder from my leaning and my perspective, and I didn't see as, great results with that. So there's definitely a place for that model. It does not need to be thrown out. I think what has shifted is that that's the only model out there. I think it's emerging into there's different branches that are starting to emerge in the mental health field that shift out of that model a little bit. But for the most part, it's the dominant model. And I think the problem, like I said earlier, is people are experiencing a lot of existential dread, especially right now in our world. I mean, wow, what a wild ride right now, right? And I think people are feeling a lot of existential dread, and some of these deeper questions are coming up for people, like, what's the point? What are we doing? Why is it like this? Why am I here? Why do I feel this way? That behavioral interventions just aren't working for. But it doesn't feel like there's anywhere else to go, right? So people go to therapy. And maybe then they're diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder because, well, you just have this general sense that things suck. So, you fit this description of symptoms. So we'll use that diagnosis and then we can treat you with cognitive behavioral therapy. And, maybe that works for some, but I think for a lot of people, I know for a lot of people, it doesn't. And maybe they get temporary relief of symptoms, but the feeling comes back because the behavior wasn't really the problem. And, operating in the mental health model with the DSM, where we use to diagnose individuals, we can start to pathologize like normal human reactions and experiences to present day circumstances. Or we pathologize normal human experiences, maybe that have come up across their history. The human condition is very contradictory, and it can be easy to look at it and say, well, if this didn't happen, then maybe it wouldn't have been this way, and make it feel like it's wrong or bad or it could have been different, when the human condition is inevitable. So when we pathologize normal human experiences, we kind of reinforce an idea that there's something wrong, which can actually increase the anxiety that someone may be feeling. So, it's a mixed bag right now, the mental health model. But I think when we come to therapy with those deeper existential problems, and for a lot of people, that actually does show up relationally. There's like a phenomenon that occurs, I think, when we're in the world of like doing the work. It's kind of how it gets phrased, like doing the work. And it's a little bit insidious, I think, what it can do to the person when they're coming in with soul level issues, but getting reframed as a mental or an emotional, like cognitive issue. And that if they just understand themselves enough, then maybe it will go away. So people start to learn to relate to themselves almost like projects, and their inner experience can, if we're like a lot of surveillance going on, a lot of monitoring, and a lot of effort into understanding their reactions, attachment style, nervous system state, boundaries, needs. I mean, like the list goes on. It's just a lot of internal checklists. And I think it's helpful to understand yourself from an outside perspective. And these are very helpful tools. But when the original issue is never addressed, it can start to stay in the state of project. Like it's like a perpetual project because there's always another layer to uncover, more monitoring and surveillance, that if you just pay enough attention, then you'll figure out the thing that will then make it all stop. And I've seen that cause a lot of distress for people too. Like this feeling of like, is the work ever going to end? And again, I think when we're coming to therapy with those existential, like old, ancient existential questions, and we're operating in the idea of like, well, if I can just regulate enough and set the right boundaries and understand my patterns enough and react perfectly every time I get upset and communicate in the right structure with the right framework, then maybe life will start to feel easier. And, you know, it's tiring. And relationships can start to feel more distant in that paradigm as well. Um, because not only are you monitoring yourself, but now you're also like monitoring the other person. And I mean, I know this because I've done this a lot in my relationships in the beginning when I started to work with them. I was like, all right, I just got to figure out the formula for this, and then everything will feel easier. And there's no formula. So, anyway, everything can just start to feel like work, basically. And vulnerability starts to feel blocked. We can even weaponize therapeutic language sometimes, feeling like, oh, because I've done the work and you haven't, I'm better, and, you need to figure it out. Or meaning even can get pushed aside because we're not actually connecting with the parts of ourselves that are experiencing the yearning or the longing or the pain or the desperation for things to feel different. So, the mental health model today, for those issues that I'm talking about, the existential ones, the human ones, the ones that maybe I could fit in generalized anxiety disorder, or maybe I could fit in major depressive disorder, but are you anxious and depressed as a circular experience? Because if you come to therapy feeling anxious or depressed and you describe your symptoms to me, and then I open my DSM and I say the symptoms you just described are the same ones here under this diagnosis, so that means you must have this. And okay, so you're depressed. Now here's the best treatment options for depression. Probably going to be cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy. And again, they can be helpful, but Then there's the effort to maintain, because were you actually, like, did we ever actually talk about why you're depressed or how that depression came to be or what your soul is feeling that led you to feel worthless or hopeless? So I think it's deeper than just looking at the root cause, because the other aspect of it is we don't operate in vacuums. Like, humans are inherently affected by everything that goes on around them. There's just no way around that. You can be the most self sufficient person in the world. You can be the most regulated person in the world. You could have done all the years of therapy. Like, you are going to be affected by things because you're human. So, when we're looking at it and we're looking at the person, understanding, like, it's not just what happened in your world that led to this, but it's like what happened in the world as you relate to it. Like, what have you been affected by? It's just so much bigger than one's own individual experience. So this is kind of where I diverge away from the mental health model, particularly in, I think, the clients that come to see me. And not always. If you're a client and you've worked with me and you're listening to this, you're like, I don't resonate with any of this. It's not like every single person I've worked with resonates with this, but a lot of them do. I diverge a little bit away. Like, if you've ever worked with me, I don't focus on diagnoses. I don't focus on symptoms unless I've worked with someone for a while and I can see that there's more, maybe the mental health model does fit for them. And this is outside of the lens I'm seeing through. But for the most part, a lot of the people I work with, I shift away from it and I meet them in the human to human experience. And the mental health model can put a lot of limits on therapists too, in the way that we sit with people in the human experience. There's so much regulation, which is good. We want people to be safe and protected, but it also can create a lot of fear in the therapist that, like, they don't want to be too human with their clients. So the setting, the clinical setting, when you're experiencing like a soul level disruption in your life and you're in a clinical setting, it's just something about it doesn't feel right, right? I mean, it just kind of feels off. Maybe I'm the only one that thinks that. I don't know, but it just feels off. You're having grief or despair or hopelessness or longing or loneliness. I mean, there's so many like deep, painful experiences we can have in being human. And then you come to therapy where there's this like expectation you're just going to share all that with this stranger and get vulnerable with them. And maybe they're a little cold because maybe they don't know how to sit with that, or they're afraid of being too human with you and what that could mean for their license, or, I mean, a variety of things. And then you leave feeling worse than when you went in. I know I've had that experience. I'm just talking about my own experience now, but I think it's hard. It's hard for the therapist, it's hard for the client. The clinical edges of the human experience, it's, I don't know. So, to sum up here, this is kind of why I wrote The Process of Unbecoming and started the Unbecoming Hub, is so that I can have a different model to sit with people in that respects the human condition and honors the soul and the wholeness and completeness of a human, the inherent qualities of being human, and the contradiction of the inherent qualities of being human and the human condition, and how to make peace with being human and the experiences that we have here outside of a pathological framework, because I couldn't do it anymore. I'm grateful for the therapists out there that operate well in that mental health model, because it is needed and there are issues that it fits like a glove. But I think in absence of having anywhere else to go, a lot of people feel like they have nowhere else to go with some of these deeper questions. They come to therapy, it's just not a match. And I'm a therapist, I don't feel a match in it. So shifting out of it. I think that's it. I could talk about this forever. This is already way too long. Maybe I'll make a second episode about some other things. I don't know. But I'll leave this one here for now. I'll see you next time. You can find more of this work at theunbecominghub.com. Until next time.